and welcome back to the Big C Church podcast. I am your host, Dr. Angie Ward. On the Big C Church podcast, we aim to have conversations, challenging conversations to help better the body. And so I'm so glad you've joined us today. We are in a series on pastors and power, and today we are going to be talking about the lure of celebrity. And my guest is a longtime dear friend of mine, Dr. Pastor Reverend Professor Rick Dunn, mostly my friend. So Rick is the lead pastor at Fellowship Church in Knoxville, Tennessee. He's been there for a very long time. He's also a co-host of a podcast called Life Reframed. He's an author of Shaping the Spiritual Life of Students, a couple other books, and founder and leader of Leadership. But I've known him since he was a professor of mine in college, and he performed my wedding from Dave. So, Rick, it's good to see you coming from Knoxville and me in Denver.
Absolutely. Well, I wished I was there with you in Denver, but let's lead with "I'm your friend." Angie.
Yeah, exactly.
All the things you just said,
I know.
that's kind of my favorite.
Yeah, so. Mine too, for sure. Yeah, yeah. Tell me a little about first of all your context. You're at Fellowship Church in Knoxville, Tennessee, but how long have you been there? How big it is? Kind of your role there.
Right. Yeah, so I left the Trinity Seminary College context as a professor in '97, and which has been 26 years.
Wow.
And the first part of my journey here was not as lead pastor. The first 5 years, I was in multiple different transitional kinds of roles. I was in transition. The church was trying to figure itself out. So I always say I never quite knew what my job was, but I tried to be faithful.
That's right. That's right. Right.
And then I wound up as the interim lead pastor and then the lead pastor of a quite unique moment in the life of a church, transition from founder, extraordinarily externally successful, extraordinarily internally conflicted.
Yeah.
And so that was quite the moment to step into at 41.
Wow. And tell me about Fellowship Church now. Like, how big is it? And I know it's in Knoxville, so you've got a lot of UT students, faculty, staff.
Yeah. So I actually don't know what the attendance is because I never look. I don't have any idea what the membership is. That'll factor into our conversation.
Yeah.
But if you'll take all the kids and students and stuff who are active there on a Sunday morning or Sunday out, kind of the connection, it's probably 4,000 a week, wow. 3,500 to 4,000. And one of the things that we've done to try to steward that is plant other churches. So in the last decade, prior to my coming on staff, there were 2 church plants, but in the last decade, we've planted 6 churches. And then now we are launching those churches into their own church planting network.
Oh,
the
wow.
whole design. We're always I'm a create and vacate person. Create it, find the right leaders, and send it out. So we've sent out a church planting network from Fellowship Church, and we're also in a major transition. I kind of fired myself recently.
Yeah.
So I thought my time was up, so I fired myself. But in a really healthy, good way, we're making some transitions. And so I don't know if that's relevant to this conversation, but I'm definitely very reflective about what 21 years of leadership have been like, because it's a wonderful moment to get to lead the church. It's a wonderful moment to give it away to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you said what did you say? Something and vacate. What was the words you used?
Create and vacate.
Create and vacate.
That's what I did.
Yeah. But even in that, you and I have talked about, and we've known each other a long time and walked together through a lot of stuff. You've talked about like you're aware of, and it also helps that your wife is fantastic therapist. So you've got to work on this stuff all the time. But we've talked about the lure of celebrity and what it does to you, and kind of just the temptations and the reality that you are like this. You are a well-known public figure at this point in Knoxville, and with community leaders and among your congregation. You're the guy, all that. So talk about like what that journey has been like. How have you realized that? Were there certain moments where you went, oh my goodness, I have some power or authority, or there's danger here? Just whatever you want to share.
Yeah. Well, I'm a metaphor person, so I'm going to tell you a story that will help.
I'd expect nothing less.
That's right. So our Teresa and I's dearest friends, Stephen and Carol Hines, who live in the Chicago area, and Stephen is a therapist, and he's also a equine therapist. And so he utilizes the context of horses and experiences with horses to do part of his therapy. So I had him down when I first became lead pastor. I had him come down to Knoxville and work with my staff with horses. So there are multiple exercises, but one was we stood at the bottom of this grassy knoll. We were standing at the bottom as a staff. There's like at the time only maybe 10 or 12 of us pastors. And at the top of the hill was a huge, beautiful brown chestnut horse. And he said, and he told us, I'm going to send this horse down the hill and I need you to turn it. Mm. But you can't, obviously you don't want to stand in front of it or touch it. You just have to turn it. So the horse comes galloping full blood. I mean, the ears are up, the tail's up. I mean, it's just, this horse is in full glory coming down that hill. And we all run out and go, turn, go, you know. And the horse literally treated us as if we were meaningless gnats to swish away with his tail. There was no turn, right? None.
Yeah.
So he came over, Stephen came over and he said, well, what that just happened? And we kind of talked about it. And he said, well, who's the leader? And I said, well, I am, you know, rhetorical, but yeah. He said, then get bigger. Then you need to get bigger. Mm. So the horse goes up the top of the hill, same scenario, runs galloping down. And then I just charge with full assertiveness, like body, soul, mind, spirit, voice. Turn now. And literally, Angie, the horse went.
Wow.
And it was the first moment I understood the power of leadership. Mm. And I say this about leadership, it entices and it scares me at the same time. It entices me and it scares me. And I grew up, you know, my background, I didn't grow up around leaders. I didn't grow up around leadership. I didn't kind of know even how the thing worked. I didn't even know how to get bigger. But it's pretty wild what happens when a leader gets bigger. And if you get a bigger leader in a bigger context and the leader keeps getting bigger, then there's a bunch of questions about stewardship, power, authority, role, and what is big in the kingdom when Jesus said, hey, you see the Gentiles over there? Don't do that. You see the Pharisees over there? Don't do that. Well, both of them were trying to make themselves bigger in different ways. So therein is the tension that I experience in being a public leader, at least in my little pond.
Yeah. Yeah. So talk about what are the enticements, good and bad?
Yeah, sure. Well, so, you know, there have been times where I've thought of like Homer's Odyssey and just strap myself to the mast, because you stand in front of a group of people and I don't care how much you know it is the Spirit of God doing it. When you watch more than 1,000 people at a time, multiple thousands of people turn with your voice, when you see people come to you and, you know, like I had one person, I was told this story. They were in a small group, and she didn't have a dad, and so they're going around the group and saying, "Well, who is either what's your dad like or your father figure?" She's like, "I don't really have a dad, but my father figure is Rick Dunn. I've never met him. But he's my father figure." Like, wow. You start multiplying that, Angie, and like if I walk into a public place or I walk into a conversation at the church, it immediately stops and turns to me.
Yeah.
Unless, if you know my American culture, unless someone more important with more money comes in than me, and then it turns to them.
Yeah.
So the seduction is, I'm a powerful person.
Yeah.
People respond to me as a powerful person. The bigger I get, the more response I get. The more people attribute to me certain qualities. And I want to feel powerful. And the seduction for me is I didn't grow up feeling powerful. I've struggled with what strength means and what masculinity means. I don't buy the cultural norms, but I also don't like kind of my background on this either. And so I'm trying to figure that out. And then here's all of a sudden, like the drug, it's so much adrenaline in your body. You can literally feel your body responding to people responding to your leadership. And if in the moment you think, I mean, you are so vulnerable and in so much danger. The healthy side of that would be it would not have been wise for Joseph to say to Pharaoh, hey, I don't really want to be second in command. I feel like that's being arrogant.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that doesn't work. Like, this is actually what you're called to do.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty powerful position. I always tell people, by the way, they say, I don't know if I can work for a secular person. I need to work for a Christian. I'm like, Joseph's boss thought he was God.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
you're okay.
exactly. Yeah.
You're okay.
Right.
So, but Joseph is exalted, and he was told he was
Yeah.
going to be exalted,
Yeah.
but it came from a different place for him. And so I just um, every part of my fiber of my being that thinks you're going to find satisfaction, fulfillment, and power in being that powerful person is at risk. Every part of me is like, I just control obedience and faithfulness. He determines outcome, and I'll steward what he gives me. But only, as Paul said, let people regard us as this. 2 Corinthians 4:1 and 2, as stewards of the gospel and servants of Christ. Above all, it is required of servants to be faithful. And that word servant is under rower, the guy on the bottom row of the two-story boat, which is not a good place to be. You got to remember that every day. I'm a bottom rower in the kingdom. It just happens to get a lot of attention.
So, I mean, you're talking now toward the end of your time leading fellowship. I mean, were you like this when 20 years ago?
Well,
What brought you to this?
yeah.
I mean, now you've reckoned with it, you've come to terms with the power, all that kind of thing, but how'd you get to this?
Well, I think it probably helped Joseph to be thrown in a pit in a prison.
Yeah.
And what was most helpful for me was when I became the lead pastor, that was not my experience. When I became the lead pastor, 60% of the people left, half the elders, and two-thirds of the staff. So I didn't start out with a particularly,
You weren't so
um,
exalted at the start.
no, I
Yeah.
was not exalted.
Yeah.
I was being burned in effigy, not exalted. Um, I remember, like, I would go into the back parking lot and just cry
Mm,
because I didn't want to do it anymore.
mm.
Uh, and I had to go preach to a dwindling congregation that was skeptical and distrustful, and the organizational doubt had reached, like, you know, epidemic levels. And and I prayed once, and I said, Lord, what do you want me to do? Because I don't want to do this anymore, and you haven't released me from this, and these people don't want me.
Mm.
They want their guy back. They don't want me. And the Lord was really clear to me. He said, love them,
Mm.
just love them. And then I talked to Brendan Manning, and I told Brendan Manning, I said, hey, these people treat me like I'm their stepfather and they want dad back. And he said, you are their stepfather, but stop acting like it.
What do you mean by that? Or what did you take him to mean by that?
Just steward the role of what you're called to do, shepherd the people, love the
Yeah.
people, tell them the truth, love them, and do what a loving
Dad would be a dad, basically.
dad, or
Yeah.
parent,
Yeah. Or
or authority figure, whatever, nurturing, shepherding. It doesn't have to be dad, but in that role, I am a dad. I'm more of a granddad now, but yeah. So I think uh, it comes back to what am I actually offering the people, not how are they responding. So
mm,
I think I've done really good leadership, and people walked away from me, and some really powerful, actually the most powerful people in the church walked away from me.
mm.
And I've done the same leadership with more of awareness of my weakness, and more people have moved toward me. And I'm like, it helps that I'm in a university town, because I've watched 100,000 people yell and scream their approval and love for a man because his team was winning SEC championships
Right.
in football. And the moment he starts losing, I've seen them turn him into a despicable human being who's unworthy of any good thing.
Yeah.
And so I've concluded the crowd's pretty darn fickle, and that most people relate. I don't want to say most people relate to a public figure based on what they're getting from the public figure, not based on who the public figure is.
Yeah. So, along those lines, one of the conversations of the series, our friend Tim Kohler, who you've met, my colleague out
Yeah,
here, he was talking
yeah.
about leadership being like a mutual relationship, not just transactional, but the role of the follower in that. How have you um, helped your followers, the people that you're leading and stewarding, if they want a king, or they sometimes want people on a pedestal, how do you shepherd and teach them
Mm.
what's a healthy relationship there between
Yeah.
the celebrity, or to where it's like, yeah,
Right.
you do it. There's a reality of your power and authority and your
Right.
role,
Right.
and yet it can be unhealthy both ways.
Yeah. Great. Those, I don't know what they're called. I wish I had the title, but I don't know if you've ever seen like the sailboat races like they have on Lake Michigan,
Yeah.
and they have and the boats, they put them at an angle.
Yeah.
Depending on where the wind is, they don't actually keep them level. They put them at an angle. So I've angled my leadership against it.
Hmm.
Uh, so from the very beginning, I perceive power as something I steward for the opportunity to invite others to share in that power. And so I've given it away. I mean, I immediately was not the 50, 40 week preacher, teacher, whatever you want to call it. I found another person to teach, partly because I didn't want to spend all that time doing all that when I could be leading and developing people. I think some of the expectations on the mega speaker thing in American church is just like, oh God, like this is not going to end well. And so, as the years have gone on, I've given away more. I've never given away the actual leadership point, vision, and the final decision making. But I've given as much as I could away, and it's actually why I'm leaving, because I've given away so much and developed leaders to the point that I am now the limiting factor on my young leaders
Hmm.
and my church's growth.
Hmm.
And so, in that sense, it's you have to get away from the idea that I've never actually thought of myself as the lead pastor of Fellowship Church. I've thought of myself as the steward uh, God entrusted to care for the church as a lead pastor for a season.
Hmm.
And that's it. That's all I do. Um, and I'm still shocked that it works. I'm shocked. I mean, I'm like, I don't know how this works, because I'm a hot mess. So, and then so I just I give it away. I don't, and I think they also know I don't want it. Like I only steward that power for the purposes of their growth and development. I don't want to steward it for my purposes, because it's not for me. I've got other ways to take care of myself. I don't I wear this ring on my right hand. People always ask me, why are you wearing a wedding band on your right hand? I said, because I wear this to remind myself that I serve the bride of Christ, and I'm not to seduce her, flirt with her,
Hmm.
need her, or do anything that distracts her attention from her husband.
Hmm. What do people
So
do when they hear that?
I think most people are like, I think that's cool, but it's not what I expected.
No.
And of course, I get really teary talking about it,
Yeah.
because it's my constant struggle to validate myself off of the body of Christ
Hmm.
affirmation that doesn't belong to me.
Yeah.
Um, I have also the extra gift, and my back. Like, there's no way there's no way I should be doing this. Like, I don't have background. I don't have. You take most of my experiences till I'm in my late 30s, and you couldn't take a string and you couldn't find the thread that got me to where I'm doing what I'm doing right
Yeah.
now. And so I don't have this sense of climbing some ladder and of achieving. And I would actually say, because they're in the process now of internally finding the next lead pastor. And I've told the candidates, if you want this job for the job, you're already in too much trouble.
Hmm.
If you want to be faithful to the Lord and he asks you to do this in order to do it, that's fine. But don't be fooled by this. This will be harder. If you do it well, it will take more than it gives,
Hmm.
and you will find yourself having to grow in ways you've never grown before, with a lot of internal conflicts, which can be very redemptive, but it's a redemption story, not a success story.
Yeah. And did you tell them save up your money for therapy and coaching and spiritual direction?
Yeah, yeah. Well, exactly. Well, they've watched me do it, so I
Yeah.
think they know. And that's what my role is, staying at the church for a season, is to coach, because it's such a young staff, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of coaching that I can bring, and experience and wisdom. But um, you know, I think the first thing, Angie, is if you're in a role where you're finding your influence and power, I don't care where it is. You're an author. You see your
Yeah.
influence grow.
For sure.
When it happens, you're like, partly, thank God, I knew this was in me. I knew he wanted me to do this, and I see the fruit of it, and I love the fruit of it. And then there's all these little things that get kind of laced in there with like pressure to keep performing, or I could do that better, or what if I did this, or and then that sense of like, well, all these people think all these great things about me, and I'm actually just a pretty hot mess human being. So another way that I've protected my church is I've just had a lot of people in my life who knew who I really was, and I've often told my church, I don't tell them things that are inappropriate publicly, but I do not aspire to their projecting onto me anything of celebrity or otherness or specialness, or I have, like, I think that's the most detrimental thing I could do for them, because one of the reasons celebrity works in American churches is so that people in the audience, I won't call them the congregation, the audience can have a vicarious experience with the speaker of being spiritually alive. That way they don't have to take responsibility for all the stuff in their own life.
Yeah. Wow.
And I just I don't want to participate in that.
Yeah. Yeah. I keep thinking. I heard a story recently of a pastor in town. Was a friend was going to lunch with him, and he said, "Yeah, this is my friend. He's a student, and the student, but who's a pastor." He said, "I'm not just a student." He told the wait staff person, "I'm not just a student. I'm pastor of a very large church on the south side of town." That was how he introduced himself.
Well, because it becomes your identity, right?
Yeah.
If I'm not that,
Yeah, if you're not what do you need to do to not, what would you tell that person? What would you tell younger leaders who
yeah,
don't, you're looking with the benefit of hindsight and having done a lot
right,
of work.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'm just kind of going back through my files and things I tell leaders. I'm a real proponent of we don't live, God has zero investment in your human success story. He has given his son for your divine redemption story. Live in that story. And those conflict, right? So which one do you fall to? When it all hits the fan, which do you fall to? The success story to manage it, or the redemption story to be transformed in it? So that's the first thing. It's just, what am I doing here? What's the scoreboard for this whole thing? I wouldn't tell them this because and I don't want anybody else to marry my wife, but that's a great idea. Like, marrying her was the best idea,
Yeah.
because she literally, I once said to her, "You don't even care about my success." And she said, "I don't care about your success. I love you and I want you. I don't really care what you do in your world."
Yeah.
It's not that she doesn't care in some, but
Right.
that's not the motivation. She doesn't get anything. For one thing, she's as prominent or more prominent than me in a lot of places, but she just doesn't, she's not enamored with that at all. So surround yourself with people who know you, and you talk to about who you are. And there's like, you can't hook a flat surface, right? Like, if you got a flat surface, you can't put a hook on it. It only works if you have a hook. Well, we all have these hooks that can be hooked by this pride, this power, this accomplishment, this celebrity, whatever you want to call it. And I don't think the hooks matter if you're working on this. And so keep working on this. And that means you can't do it by yourself. You're going to have some kind of Sherpa, counselor, coach, a group around you. And I have all those. Like, I've surrounded myself. That's actually I have people like you and Dave and other people who I gravitate towards for my relationships and my deep conversations, because our relationship is rooted in years of history with each other and walking through good, bad, and ugly together. And so then I don't have to, when I do the thing where I might be getting the feedback that makes me feel special, I'm like, yeah, well, actually, if you knew these people, they would say something different, but they would also say something deeper about who I really am. And they do love and respect me. And so it's not just like I'm sloughing all that off. It's, I don't have a hook because I don't need your affirmation. Obviously, I want to do a good job. Obviously, I don't have a problem with my church growing. For whatever reason, I'm gifted for multiplying. It's what I do. I mean, I started a basketball organization and multiplied. Like, what I do multiplies. So I don't want to throw that gift out. But I can't measure success by it because I don't control all those kinds of things. And some of the biggest things people build in Christendom are probably should never have been built to start with, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Talk about, you also talk about like there's the power of kind of the organization and the success. You just have, it's like Joseph, whatever he put his hand to, God
Yeah.
prosper. There's also even like the personal, like you've talked about, I've heard you talk about like going into a restaurant and you could,
Oh
like
yeah.
all these perks kind of things. So talk about some of
Yes.
those experiences.
Here's a funny thing. So we went with our best friends, the Hineses, on a European river cruise. First time we'd ever
Yeah.
done it. Long time we've done it. And I was at a particularly like leadership had just been hard for a season. I
Yeah.
was like tired.
Yeah.
And I said, the one thing I'm most looking forward to is not having to think about, talk about fellowship. I love the people. I love it. But this has just been a hard season. And I know I'll come back ready to go, but right now I just want to get away. And the boat had 127 passengers on it. And we boarded in Geneva, in Zurich, Switzerland. So I'm like,
Yeah.
thank God. So I get on the boat and I drop my luggage off and I walk into the galley for the kind of the orientation
Yeah.
meeting on the boat. And someone says, Rick Dunn!
Ugh.
And she was from Knoxville. She'd been baptized at Fellowship Church. I was like, oh my gosh. So, I mean, and part of that, she was living in another city. Part of that's because um, we are a young church and we send a lot of young adults and college students out. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of people leave and go. So our alumni is pretty large. And I want to say this: if she ever hears this podcast, she was amazing. We had a few conversations. I never felt like I was supposed to talk about church. I always
Yeah.
thought felt personal, and I always felt like she respected my space. So I really
Yeah.
appreciate that. Some people don't do that, right?
Yeah.
But yes, I often go to the restaurant. The owner goes to my church, or I go to the event, and I have VIP opportunities and things like that. And but I don't get as many maybe as others do because the people know I don't really like it's not a thing I'm pursuing or
Yeah.
I do like it when I can get reservations quickly at my favorite restaurant. I
Yeah.
mean, I do like that.
Yeah.
But I hope that's more out of just he knows me than it is because I'm quote the pastor or and I'm also in the South, which is weird about pastors and churches and
Yeah.
the Bible Belt's different than other parts of the country too. So you have to be aware that there's some stigmatism or um, projection onto that role that's
Yeah.
like really unhealthy. And I just don't. One of the things I did, Angie, is I made myself known in the community as an AAU basketball coach, and I spent a ton of my time building my relation. I spend a ton more time with coaches than I do pastors.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't traffic well in mega church pastor world. I just don't think about the same things. That's not good or bad. I just don't. I traffic really well. I love coaches. I just think they're the best. And so that was also a thing. I'm actually known. I remember this one kid was playing for a team. I was doing some rec basketball as well as AAU. One kid came to church and he said to his dad, he said, "What's my coach doing up there?"
That's great. Like,
And
yeah.
I think being a fourth grader's rec basketball coach as your lead is better than mega church pastor down the street lead. I
Yeah.
think it's a healthy play. It's fine that I steward this position. I don't apologize for it. I'm not embarrassed by it. I'm not ashamed of it, but it's not who I am.
Yeah. Maybe all people with celebrity intention or desire should spend some time on a middle school retreat and remember where their
Because
place
you know
is.
what? When you're playing the celebrity thing that's got its hook in you, it came straight out of your middle school experience. You're just playing out. All
Mm,
of us are playing out our middle school experiences, and you're just trying to be at the cool kids table. And you just got to be careful because there's nothing wrong with the cool kids table, but it can really seduce you away from, what is healthy also about it is, uh, it would, it's like a 16-year-old, if, their first time out driving, they have a pretty healthy respect for typically of what
yeah.
they're doing, right?
Yeah.
Sadly, sometimes by the time they're 18 or 19, they've lost that. But I think of like when I gave my kids, like, yes, you can leave the driveway now by yourself in your multi-ton
Yeah.
vehicle.
Yeah.
I just have to think that's what God feels like when I drive out of the driveway to go to
Yeah.
work at the church.
Yeah.
It's like, I just hope he remembers what he's doing here. And also knowing that I cannot manufacture spiritual fruit. And don't confuse lots of people liking
Hmm.
you or wanting to hear what you have to say with spiritual fruit, because that's not always true.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, keep going. What do you, I mean, to younger leaders because a lot of times I've seen and I've experienced, I'm in over my head or I'm just so not aware of the danger. I mean, you just kind of go on with the flow. This is what, oh man, God must be blessing this or it feels good. Or like we're just not even aware of all that stuff to
Oh yeah,
even
yeah,
have a
yeah.
check.
Well, so if you've got grounded relationships that will help check you,
Yeah.
and you have somebody that you're actually being honest with, and you're choosing to be honest with it. So, um, my wife's a sex therapist, among other things that she does. She also does trauma work, and particularly sexual trauma work. So, if I struggle with lust or I'm watching something on Netflix and all of a sudden I'm like kind of bought in more out of the arousing than the content, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm comfortable to tell her, hey, and just heads up here on things. I'm a little struggling here with, and that means something is going on inside of me because I'm not drawn to that unless there's a hook, right?
Right.
So I would talk to my wife, but I will do the same thing when I feel seduced at church. And I'm sure people right now are like, gosh, this is very uncomfortable. We went from potentially looking at a nudity in a Netflix series to preaching at a church, and he's equating those two things. I'm not equating those two things. I'm saying there's a lot of religious spiritual pornography that goes on
Mm-hmm.
inside of leaders, because you're meeting a need with that's not designed to meet that need. That's not where that should be met.
Yeah.
That's to be met only with your father, with your savior, and with your community. And when you're, it's okay that it gets seductive. It's okay that you like, oh, I gotta be careful there. But it's not okay if nobody knows that, if you're not talking about that. um I have the opposite right now. I'm handing off the church 4 years earlier than I planned.
Mm-hmm.
And I told my wife when I made this decision, I felt like it was from the Lord. I said, I've lost my exit strategy. And I've lost my exit strategy. And I'm building a lot of things for the future that I believe God's called me to. But the proof of concept's kind of sitting there, right?
Yeah.
The gifting I'm confident of, the ability, but how to do it. And so I find myself, uh, here's the familiar, and it's seductive to me to go and get people to like me and like my teaching and still affirm me as a leader, so I don't feel so insecure and out of control about what's happening next. I got to talk about that. I got to do that. I talk to the people who get on the platform, because I only teach like 10, 12 times a year. The people get on the platform, I talk to them all the time. This is the most seductive thing you're ever going to do.
Mm.
And you've got to talk about that as if and I started saying the same way you have to talk about your potential sexual seduction. But actually, the way Christians, particularly Christian men, talk about sexual seduction is so unhealthy and helpful. I'm going to take that away and say it differently. We got to find a whole new way, all of us, male and female, talking about those things that we try to find in the external world to meet what can only be met through an internal transformation with Christ, and are only meant to be shared in the most healthy ways in conversation. So if you're a young leader and you're having no conversation about, man, that felt a little too, I actually love that a little too, I like that attention a little too much.
Yeah.
Or this thing's really growing. Now everybody in the community, used to be I'd walk in a room and nobody talked to me. Now my church is growing. Everybody wants to talk to me. That scares me. That feels like I could buy into that falsehood. Um, because Angie, inevitably you're going to do stupid. Like you're going to make a decision, say something, and it's all going to come down on you. And then if you've needed that, what you'll do is you'll hide all that's going on inside
Mm-hmm.
to manage that, so you can go out and get more affirmation and more attention and all the podcasts and all the books and all the stuff. Some of them were wolves in sheep's clothing, and some of them were just men and women who just gradually hid and hid and hid and hid until there was nowhere to go with it, and it worked its way out in some, because they made a bigger and bigger hook, and then something got it. It's always sex, power, and money, or all the above. Something hooked them, but it wasn't the external thing. It's that they created an internal structure, an infrastructure that was looking out there for that affirmation. And I'm at six. I know we're talking about young ladies, but I'm 62. And I'm scared because I don't know what's going to happen next. But I'm also hopeful. I'm more hopeful than I am scared, but I get scared. And when I get scared, it is tempting. It is tempting to find some way of affirming myself with my big church and the power that I steward. And that act numbs me from the transformative work that God wants to do in the fear. And so one thing I would say to young leaders is, where you're afraid and where your shadow side is, that's the best part. Don't run from that. Whatever you run from runs you. If you're running from it, it's running you. Don't run from it, run towards it. And the other thing, because leaders run forward, we're forward looking, so we run toward challenges, we run toward vision, we run toward goals, we run toward all the things. Your first step needs to be toward God at work in you, and then move toward all that other stuff.
Yeah.
But just particularly the machinery of a big church and the pressures and all the stuff, there's, it's, if you're the lead pastor of a mega church, all right, since we're talking that context, you're stewarding millions of dollars, thousands of people, spirituality, organization, vision, administration. You got all these kinds of things, and you can just get to the point where you're managing all that at the expense of your personal transformation, and that was never going to end well, Angie. Better to get out of it than to let that happen. But the two things that young leaders most struggle with is, I'm supposed to know what to do, and I'm supposed to do it by myself.
Yeah.
And the real answer is, most of the time, I have no idea what I'm doing, Angie. I don't know. I don't know. I'm trying to be faithful, and it takes a village for me to lead. It also takes a village for me to grow. And at the end of the day, growing up into Him is the whole point. So as long as I'm doing that, I think I can safeguard myself against the other.
Yeah. I've so many things to take out of that. One I think is ruthless honesty internally and externally.
Yes, that's great phrasing.
But that takes time, and we're so busy doing the thing, writing the books, pursuing the whatever. We're so even unaware of what's going on inside. We don't even value. So I think just valuing the time and making the time for it.
Yeah. We, on our Life Reframed podcast, Lauren and I often talk about vulnerability. And one of the things, I think she said this, that we are so drawn to vulnerability in other people, but we're so unwilling to enter into it for ourselves. And I would say, let's flip that. Let's begin by really moving into our own vulnerability, offering it in the healthy, not in an unhealthy, but a healthy way to the people that we serve, and inviting them to their place of vulnerability, because that's always where the Spirit does His work. I would say too, the other thing I say to young leaders is, I've said this for years to them, because I've handed a lot of things off. Never try to make the church work. I know you've got to deal with administration and policy, but don't make the church work in service to growing people up. And if you can't grow people up and make the church work, then change the church to grow people up, because there's nothing in the Scripture that asks you to be accountable for figuring out how to strategically make all these things work. And the leadership models that I grew up in, and you're younger than me, but you're being exposed to the late 90s and early 2000 leadership was it's idolatry. It's idolatry. Let's just name it. You got to repent of that. Me too. Like, I'm not throwing stones. I have to do it all the time. But we're literally called to spiritually shepherd people. And it gets really hard, because sometimes to spiritually shepherd people, I have to fire someone. And I hate that. But how do I do that? And what message do I communicate? Is it like, this, is it just like, hey, given where we are, given where we're trying to go, and given where you are and who you are, this is not a really good fit for what we're trying to do. And I do think I have some legitimacy because I fired myself in February.
That's
And
right.
I went to the elders and
That's
said,
right.
the mission is being held back by me. You can't see this. You think I'm advancing the mission. I'm actually holding it back. Let me help you find a pathway to a new mission, and then let me serve you in whatever way I can, and I'll figure out what I'm going to do after that.
Yeah.
And so I think there's legitimacy in the practice of that. But at the end of the day, if you're waking up thinking, is the church growing? Am I making it good? All that kind of stuff. That's why I don't look at attendance, because I just don't want to know. I don't. I mean, I want to have a general feel, but I don't want to count this number and that number and that number, because it's not the narrative I'm looking for.
Yeah.
I'm looking for who's stepping forward to serve, who's finding transformation. And I mean, baptisms are great, but you don't know. Like, I'm looking more at life change kind of things,
Yeah.
and so it's got to start with me and and the staff.
Yeah, yeah. I think of Roy, Roy Williams when he was coaching Carolina. They don't look at the scoreboard, look at what's going on the court. And, if you're take care of the things, maybe at the end the score
Oh,
will, be in your favor.
always.
So, but
But
it's,
let me say this.
yeah, go
Well,
ahead.
can I say this?
Yeah, for sure.
You talk about podcast leadership expertise. You just worked in a Roy Williams reference. That is really impressive. Like, that was like, I did not see that coming. Well done, Angie.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, yeah, that's my hallmark. I have to work in Carolina basketball or something. And yeah, Dave always
I'm on
works in
board.
like a Star Wars reference into his sermons. So that, yeah, and like and an impression of someone. So,
Yeah.
but
Go with what you know.
what you're talking about is so countercultural though. There's the idolatry of it, of the I call it the franchise of leadership or of celebrity.
Yeah.
There's the whole lure of it. That's the taking the time, doing the work, the going toward the pain. I mean, all of that is going the opposite direction
Sure. Yeah.
of what
Well,
the flow is going.
it's, and so perhaps the culture might want to just take a deep breath and listen to what he said. The Gentiles lord it over as authority. We're not going to do it that way.
Yeah.
The Pharisees want the place of highest honor. We're not going to do it that way. We're going to do it this way.
Yeah.
We're going to be faithful to the Father's redemption story, because that's the only story here. We're going to change the narrative, which may mean our churches aren't as big, or maybe, first of all, okay, I lead a big church. I believe that there's a place in the kingdom for large churches as resources, as kingdom resources. I think there's a place for them. I don't think there's a place for many of them. But if I were a young leader, I think it would be fair to look at my generation as a whole, not individuals, not being sarcastic, but how's that working for you? How has the mega church movement helped shape the culture? And what I would say is it swallowed the Kool-Aid of the culture, and the culture shaped it. And that's why leadership became an idolatry. And I don't know why, Angie, I happen to walk into these kinds of spaces. And I also want to acknowledge I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee. Like, good preaching, good worship, a big parking lot, and a good kids program will draw 1,000 people tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not in Rhode Island.
Yeah, like Andy Stanley says, I just need a band. It's like,
yeah. Just give some perspective here on whatever we're talking about with me. And as my good African-American brother Matthew said, hey, Rick, if you want to go somewhere where people don't know you, I got some places in East Knoxville where I live. Nobody knows you.
Yeah.
And I said, we need to fix that, Matthew. And we talk about that. What's the white response to our African-American community in Knoxville? Because they tend to be segregated from larger suburban churches, right? So you wrestle with those kinds of things, but I just don't think, I've never seen a church do anything. I have seen the church, the body of Christ, following through the Spirit, Jesus's mandate and vision for the Father's kingdom. And I've seen a lot of amazing things happen there. So let's just do that. And if it learns out to be big, okay. If it's small, okay. I would just say, they can take your listeners can take this what's worth. There's a lot of danger in just kind of flipping it the other side and saying, well, the micro church is really God's strategy. Yeah. There is just No, you're going to get in the same. You're going to get in the same boat. And quite honestly, we've got so many young church planters going out there planting on their own that we're paying off the emotional debts of mega churches right now. We're going to pay off the emotional debts of church planting if people don't invest in the lives and marriages and families of these people instead of just throwing them out there to lead something that's really hard. So that's my soapbox.
Yeah.
The strategy and methodology is not the point. It's the heart.
Yeah.
The lure of power is unique to the larger church, the larger setting, the larger, venue. And that's kind of what we're talking about. But at the end of the day, I've only found one thing that actually works, and that's surrender.
Yeah. And I don't think the
That's
lure
the
of power, I don't know that, I mean, you said the lure of power, unique to the, however you said, to the big church. And I think it's just a different type of lure.
That's a great way to say it.
Because,
It's just
I'm not the pastor of a mega church. I'm barely church famous. My books, or people say, friends said, who at Denver Seminary is famous? I'm like, define famous. She said, well, church famous. I'm like, well, so it really depends. But I've seen the same behaviors in solo pastors in a small pond. I mean, it's not really even the size of the pond. It's a different nature, but I think the lure is still to power or to getting your needs met by those strokes, no matter what.
Yeah. Well, here's we have an operating system in our flesh. Here's what I would say. We just did a podcast on this called Mental Apps, and I talked about this part of things. Is that we're all powerful people, Angie. We're made in the image of God. We have these passions, these insights. We all have a certain kind of genius. Some of that genius gets monetized by the broader culture. Some of it doesn't. We all have different things that we do Dave your husband has certain things. Teresa, my wife, has certain things. You have 2 boys. I got 2 boys and a daughter. They all, my 3 grandsons, they all have their own unique power and strength and beauty and wonder and so much to offer in the kingdom. But we have this operating system of the flesh that says, you've got to be God of that. And as soon as we become God of it, we diminish all of its true beauty, power, and strength, and we turn it into something that's about ourselves and feeding ourselves.
Yeah.
But when we surrender that and say, you know what, I'm actually not going to be God of this, do what you want to with it, there's so much more freedom there. And at the end of the day, it is the false notion that there is some kind of external celebrity thing that's going to fill this. As a matter of fact, often those are why you find the crashes is because a person's gotten to the thing they above beyond what they ever dreamed of, and it doesn't satisfy anything. It's like drinking. It's like being in a life raft and drinking salt water. You think it's going to help. It's actually going to kill you. So don't drink it. Drink the living water and you'll be fine.
Yeah. Wow. So good. Man, Rick, I love our conversations every time.
Me too.
I know it's been.
I know whether we record them or not.
I know exactly. And next time we got to do it in Knoxville or Denver, and do it in person. So thanks just
Angie,
for your wisdom.
Thank you well, thank you, and thank you for your voice and for creating this podcast. I often say to my leaders, "Hey, read this book Angie wrote, or do this," and it's not because I'm trying to make you church famous.
Right.
It's because I trust your voice.
Yeah.
And I think right now, in the moment we're in, you're trying to gather some trusted voices and offer them is very hope-filled. And so thank you for having that hope and believing in that and gathering those voices. And it's fascinating, when God's going to hears the cries of the Egyptians. He raises up Moses. He raises up Ruth. He raises up David. He raises up Mary, the mother of Jesus. He raises these people up out of the most obscure, unexpected places. And what I would love for you and I to have as our legacy, I'd love to raise up some of those voices.
Yeah.
Not for you and I to be the Moses or the Ruth or the Mary or the David, but they're there.
For sure.
And we should be full of hope that God is raising those people up. And I think this podcast will help do that. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Rick.
Yeah.